Hi, I'm Emma Kenny. You're joining me on True Crime, and I just want to say a massive thank you for all the views and comments and new subscribers. It's blown my mind. Obviously, it's important if you want to keep up with my channel to subscribe. So if you want to do that now, just give you a second to do that. It takes like one moment, but it makes a big difference for me. And I want to be able to bring these every single week. You've noticed that there's a lot of suggestions for the crimes that you want covering, and I am going to endeavour to do that. Lots of new crimes that I haven't heard of, so you're really educating me, because obviously I know about all the ones I've covered, I know about the ones that I've read in the papers, but I don't know about some of those that are completely bizarre when I look at them, but had completely escaped my knowledge. So thank you very much. It makes it so much better when you get engaged and involved, and just helps me to know the kind of content that you want. Today's case is one of those that in some ways has no justice, because the person that actually we're covering managed to evade any kind of justice in his lifetime. I mean, he was given a knighthood. Do we need to go any further than imagining a lifetime of sexual molestation towards children? And yet he gets to basically have the keys to the palace, the keys to Broadmoor, to specific children's units. That's the human being we're talking about. Someone who didn't just manage to beam into our homes throughout decades. He managed to coerce, collude, potentially involve individuals in very high places into what I would consider the procurement and use of children for sexual purposes. He will go down in history as one of the most prolific, dangerous, and unfortunately revered in his lifetime child molesters has ever been. I'm talking about, of course, Jimmy Savile. Well, from the earliest moment in my memory of Jimmy, he was an oddball. I mean, one of the things that we're always going to recognise is it's impossible to look at somebody and think they're a child molester. You know you can't do that. That's why child molesters live amongst us. They're in our neighbourhoods, they're our neighbours, sometimes they're our parents, our brothers, our sisters. So we know that there is not a prototype, a stereotype for a paedophile or a child molester. And I want to start with that very distinct difference, because I think we use the word paedophile a great deal. It's highly loaded, it's a weaponized word. Understandably, it means that you have a predilection and an attraction for children, and for most of us, that feeling makes us recoil. But a paedophile and a child molester are separate entities, because there is this whole group of individuals who refer to themselves as virtuous paedophiles. And virtuous paedophiles are individuals who recognise that they have a spectrum of attraction for children, but they have a very moral acknowledgement that they would never cause harm to a child, so they would never act on those impulses. And then we have child molesters, and they can be vicarious, so they can be people who consume child porn. You are a child molester the moment that you engage in any kind of action that causes harm to a child. And when you're viewing online footage, even though you are not involved in that direct abuse, you are. Because without you watching, it wouldn't be happening to the degree that we're seeing it, and you wouldn't be perpetuating that cycle of these children being subjected to some of the most heinous crimes that most of us, we don't even want to consider. So there is that distinction. And the reason that I say that is because in areas like Germany, our equivalent of the X Factor, that will literally play an advert advising people who have these kind of predilections to go and ask for help. Because if you can get some help and you're on a certain area of the spectrum where you know this is wrong and you need people to be able to hold you within that and work within that and help you create strategies so that you never do harm, you know, that is a good thing. Obviously in the UK, we tend to use the word paedophile in a way that can be loaded and suggest you are a molester. You are not necessarily a molester. But Jimmy Savile, he wasn't just a molester, he was an organizer. And he was so powerful. This strange looking man wearing gold lame and lycra running outfits. You know, he stuck out so grandly. This was not a man trying to hide in the shadows. And you have to ask yourself a really important question. Why was he so happy being on show? When you know what his behavior was like, and we're going to cover it. We're going to cover it in detail and in a linear fashion. Who was he? What created him? What got him the opportunities that, when you actually look at his behavior across the board, should have been called out so early on. That man should have been eradicated from our screens and imprisoned decades before he died. But the world moves on. We realise that institutional abuse, child abuse rings, sexual exploitation is a much bigger problem in our society today. But when Jimmy was younger, of course, there wasn't the internet, there wasn't the opportunity for people, as females particularly, and children, to talk about abuse. It was kind of a seen, but not heard, pushed under the carpet. And actually, let's call it as it was. If you were a kid and you said you were abused by somebody, you just got called a liar. That still happens today. I'd say that's one of the biggest problems that remains endemic in our society, that a lot of sexual abuse victims, they do tell people, but it never actually gets dealt with. Whether that's a fear in the home of those parents that too much will change, whether it's the fact that once a child says it, they're called a liar, and it means that they recede in that belief that they can do anything about it. But for whatever reason, we still have this really big issue, the issue of children not being believed when they are sexually abused. So let's take a look at Jimmy Savile. What was my first experience of that man? My first experience with Jimmy Savile doing a show called Jim'll Fix It. I mean, the irony when you think about that. A show that was developed, meaning that Jimmy Savile had access to children within his whole career. I mean, look at that power. Where he's not just a guy with access to children, sometimes vulnerable children. He's a guy that creates this whole facade of being somebody who fixed the dreams for kids. I wrote to Jimmy Savile's Jim'll Fix It saying I wanted to meet Duran Duran. This was the power. And you were hoping that you might get an audience with him. You were hoping you might end up with one of those bright red ribboned necklaces with the great big silver medal saying you'd made it. So scary looking back, right? What does that medal really stand for to those children who received it? I'm not going to say that Jimmy molested every single child that he ever met, but I have first-hand experience in my own family with my husband, whose brother had disabilities and who did meet Jimmy Savile. And he asked all of the adults in the room to leave. I can't say anything happened. It's not for me to do. But why would an adult ask a parents and carers of a disabled child to remove themselves from that situation? Kind of makes me suspicious.
I think there's probably about 500 victims. And that might seem to a lot of people, that's just a ridiculous number, that's huge. But if I give you the context in terms of predatory paedophiles, some of these predatory paedophiles, as far as victims goes, are well in excess of thousands, particularly when they've got the access. I mean, the key elements to offending behavior is three dynamics: access, opportunity, and motivation. Motivation is least important to me as an investigator, because what motivates one person can be very different to what motivates another. And actually motivation, it doesn't help me necessarily catch the offender. In fact, it's highly unlikely to do that. But what will help me catch the offender is access and opportunity. Who had access to the individual and who had the opportunity to offend? Because in terms of contact offences, unless you have access and opportunity, you can't commit that offence. You can still have your motivation, but you can't commit the offence. So access and opportunity are really key. And when we looked at Savile, we focused on those two elements and then looked to try to evidence what access and opportunity he had to those people who were giving us accounts. And we cross-checked those accounts with people. And the thing with child sexual abuse, any sexual abuse, it's a contact offence, is that by and large, these offences can happen one-to-one. So there are no witnesses. There's nobody else that sees what's taken place. So what you have to do is be in a position, well, can I put Savile at that location around that time?
So let's talk about where he comes from, who he was, what his career engendered him for, and the kind of abuse that he took part in. On the 31st of October 1926, Savile's born, and he's born in Leeds, and he's the youngest of 7 children. So we can assume that he grew up in a very, very busy household. We can also assume that when you're growing up in a household like that, it's pretty hard to get noticed, not because you're not loved, not because you're not cared for, but just because it's busy. I don't think he came from a very entitled environment, and it was probably really important for him to stand out. The first time we hear about a recorded incidence of abuse, and this is going to stay with you, just this date, 1955. In 1955, he managed a dance hall in Manchester. It was a dance hall that my mother used to attend. He actually had dinner time discos, and my mum would walk from her office with her friend and go and dance for an hour. That's what they did. And he was known at that time. But there was a recorded incident in 1955. Think about that now. Some kind of sexual misdemeanor. It would happen once, and that person would be eradicated from access to females, particularly in this case, and from working with anybody that they could come into contact with where they could be dangerous. That's why we have Home Office checks. That's why we have DBS checks. In 1960, in one of literally just a handful of examples that were given to the police, a 10-year-old boy asked Savile for his autograph outside a hotel. That boy was taken into that hotel, and he was seriously sexually assaulted by him. That's 1960. But in 1964, in spite of this, it appears that he gets offered an amazing job. He gets to be the presenter of the first ever Top of the Pops for the BBC. Now, he had before that been a DJ for Radio Luxembourg, so he had been around, he was known as a DJ. He was eccentric, he dressed differently, his crazy hair, his odd eyes, the way that he was very strange in his use of intonation. He had those strange little sayings that he'd use. I'll put a few here, those that made him famous. He was a loner in many ways, and I want you to think about that whilst I'm talking to you. He didn't have a lot of friends. How does somebody who doesn't have a lot of friends, and believe me, if there's one thing I know about the media, you have to know the right people. By the way, I don't. But you have to. I know that. I know who succeeds in the media, and they're well-connected people. How could a guy who really didn't have that many contacts as far as friendships go, not just get into the media, get into top jobs? Top of the Pops was the leading light. It became an instant success. And yeah, he'd had some radio experience, but so had a ridiculous amount of people. And yet here he is, headlining it. Now, one of the things that I want to bring to this channel is pieces of information you probably didn't know. And even if you've seen documentaries, you haven't actually heard this. So even omitted from the obituaries. And remember, at this point, he was like an icon, you know. Everyone was completely devastated that this weird, eccentric, oddball in the bizarre outfits had died, because he'd raised millions and millions from charity. It's really funny, isn't it? Money can be used in so many ways. Just think about the climate at the moment. Think about the climate. Who's running the world? Is it for the good of people? Or is it about financial gain? Think about it. About 9 people in the whole of the world have doubled their trillionaire status. So money doesn't equate to being a good person, right? But you can make yourself seem like a good person, can't you, with money? And that's what Jimmy Savile did. He used all of his charity work to arguably make him seem credible, kind, and give him access to things that he'd never have had access to. Because money talks, and it can help your organisation, and it can pay your wages. So one of the things that didn't actually get in to his obituary was, wait for it, his wrestling career. That's right. Jimmy Savile, in the late 1960s, which did actually start as a fundraising event initially, created a career as, bizarrely, a wrestler. Even in the ring, he was known as a bizarre character. He had really eccentric ways. And records actually indicate that he lost the first of his 35 107 professional fights. Listen to that, professional fights. But he was still always high up on the bill. And it wasn't because he was good, but it was because he was a celebrity. So even in points where he shouldn't really have made it very far, because of course he wasn't a wrestler, just take a look at him. I'm pretty sure that I could have had to go in the ring and probably beaten him up as well. The point is that he made it because money talks, celebrity status talks. It still does. Think about people leaving Love Island. They go from somebody you've never heard about to having massive endorsed campaigns and being on the front of every magazine and basically getting into every club and paying for nothing for the period of time that they get to be around. That's what celebrity status does. It opens doors. These days, only temporarily, but in those days, remember, you were watching TV. You might be listening to the radio. They were the 2 mediums. There was nothing else. So if you made it on that silver screen, you were special. Oh, and he knew that. And he knew how to manipulate people because of that. Now, there isn't a lot of on-record, information about his career in wrestling, mainly because mass media didn't exist, did it? It wasn't chronicled in the same way. Literally these days, you can cough and someone will have a record of it somewhere. But back in the day, it wasn't the way that we record things because we didn't have social media, we didn't have constant tech, we didn't have YouTube. How did we ever cope without YouTube? But the point was that he was doing it. And also we see that one of the things that he wanted to do was to constantly work on his profile. So people weren't that interested in why he was doing it, they were just interested that he did. Years on, in 1999, whilst the show Have I Got News For You was on, Angus Deaton, who was the original presenter, actually asked Savile, were you ever a wrestler? And he replied, I still am. Just wait for it. I'm feared in every girls' school in this country.
You used to be a wrestler, didn't you?
I still am.
Oh, yeah.
I'm feared in every girls' school in this country.
He was telling you that he was powerful, used his bodily aggression to molest children in girls' schools. Could you be any more present with your predatory behaviour and any more arrogant in the knowledge that you could say and do anything and no one was going to challenge you? Not even mainstream media. On the same show, he was also asked what he used his caravan for, because he had this caravan for years. And what did he do in it? And he replied, anyone I can get my hands on. I mean, just stop for a minute and think about what that says. He's literally admitting that he was going out of his way to molest young girls and to use his caravan that he'd had forever to basically attack people. He was a predator in plain sight, but more than that, he was a proud predator in plain sight that liked to use his status to let all his victims know that they had no power and that he had an entitlement to do whatever he chose. That's what makes him so despicable, so disgusting, so dangerous, and also so protected. And ask yourself that. Who is protecting him? And where are they now? In 1965, and this is chilling, somehow that man gets to go and work as a volunteer porter at Stoke Mandeville Hospital, where he was also a volunteer. Now, Stoke Mandeville Hospital had children with disabilities who'd suffered abuse, who were very vulnerable. And actually, one of the things that the nurses would say to those children, because they were uncomfortable, but remember there's a power imbalance here. You see, power is a really interesting thing. If you are powerful, you create fear. Your capacity to do reputational damage to people who might question you. Just think about it at work. You know, you've got a boss who's being cruel. How likely are you to go and complain to their boss? Because you think, chances are it's going to cause me some pain. So people are complicit in their silence, not because they don't want to change, not because they don't want to challenge, but because they know that the chances are it will not be the person causing the problem who's out on their ear, it will be them. Savile had a really long-term volunteer project at Stoke Mandeville Hospital. He had access all that time at Leeds General Infirmary. And records show that in 1965, abuse started at the BBC. 1965. Is this not making you want to scream? In 1966, this is a really important year. Because obviously, Jimmy has been abusing kids for a very long time anyway. And certainly as his fame starts to grow, he's going to have more access. But there's another really important thing to come into play here. When you get away with things, and then when you get more power, then you up your ante. Because you imagine that you are completely invulnerable. You're not somebody who can be targeted because you've got away with it for so long. And not only getting away with it, you're getting this validation. You're getting jobs with kids who are vulnerable, and people are just leaving you to it because you're Jimmy Savile, right? The guy who raises all that money for charity. Why would you be questioned? But people were questioning. Nurses were questioning. Nurses were telling those children, be asleep when he comes. How would that have been for those kids? This icon walking onto the ward, top of his game, being told, act like you're not here, act like you're asleep. Because they all automatically knew that those children needed protection. Now we know that this is the peak period from 1966 onwards. And we think that this period lasted around a decade. Imagine how many kids he's got access to. It's terrifying. And remember, abusers are brilliant. They're so good at manipulation. Children don't realise they're being abused most of the time. We don't talk about that a lot because it's easier to see things in black and white. Well, a child would know what it's like when somebody molests them. No. Most children that are molested don't understand what's happening. They just know that something uncomfortable is occurring. Sometimes they might even feel special. Because, you know, if you come from a really vulnerable background and somebody gives you gifts and tells you you're special, if somebody's famous and lets you know that you're somebody who stands out for them, and maybe you've had a really challenging life and parents who didn't really care for you, maybe you've even been abused before, and then somebody just perpetuates that, but tells you that you must be special because they're special. You see, that's how the cycle of abuse begins. It doesn't mean that a child is being violently assaulted. They can be being gently coerced, each equally as devastating. But nonetheless, Savile was getting good at his game. Now, at this point, I want to exhume his body and cut it into a million pieces. I know that might seem extreme, but it's because I cannot believe that this human being, this excuse for a man, was able in 1970 to go to a school called Duncroft Girls' School, just near Staines, Surrey. He was a regular visitor. Why? Just ask yourself that. Like, how many adults do you know? How many celebrities do you hear of going into all these vulnerable settings constantly? Building these relationships in spaces where he was given the freedom to operate however he wished to operate. Simultaneously to this, you also have to remember that he was never in relationships. In fact, he was considered an asexual. When we use the word asexual, the suggestion is an individual without a libido, particularly without a desire for a relationship. So he's eccentric. He buys into that eccentricity by dressing in bizarre ways. Sorry, you can dress however you want. But as a celebrity, he stands out in a very specific way. He wants everyone to notice him. He isn't under the radar. He regularly starts to visit Duncroft girls' schools, meaning that he's got access to all these kids with problems, all these kids desperate to be noticed. When the women who were abused by him spoke after the abuse came out, those girls who attended Duncroft School said he was really manipulative. He had this amazing Rolls Royce. You know, you would be chosen. You've come from a background where you've been systematically sexually abused by other people. And suddenly, you've got this icon, this superstar, picking you out. You're the special one. You're the one who can get taken for a ride in his car. And even though those girls were forced into oral sex, and even though those girls were constantly molested by him, remember, when you don't stand out anywhere, when your own family have let you down, abused you, rejected you, just being seen, just being given attention is often something you will choose even though it's terrible for you, because you don't know that it's wrong, because this is all you've ever known, and he knew that. He selected that school based on the most vulnerable and easy to access, and also because he felt that they wouldn't feel that they had the power to say no. Again, power is always thread through everything he does. It's his weapon. And of course, without doubt, it's also connections. Because be under no illusion, guys, Jimmy Savile didn't work alone. And I'm sure there are a lot of guilty people who still haven't been brought to justice. But I also trust that as time goes on, we will find more and more and more out, because these kind of things haven't gone away. They won't go away. And life has a really, really clever way of karma arriving in the end. And even though I'm going to talk about this a little bit later on, what Jimmy Savile wanted to be known as was Sir Jimmy Savile Icon. And now all he's known is a dirty, disgusting paedophile. So even though we never got to send him to prison, we made sure that we decimated his character. He's one of the most hated individuals in the UK now, probably worldwide for those who knew him. And that isn't the justice we would have liked, let's be honest, rotting away in a jail cell, having to be in a ward of area where he has to be protected because he's considered such a disgusting disgrace of a human. Believe me, in prison there's a code. He is at the bottom of that code, and you don't want to go to prison when you fit it. I wish he'd had that, but unfortunately we didn't get to see that happen. But like I said, everything about him has been completely decimated. The people of Leeds are embarrassed. His headstone's been removed, and I'm so proud, because that gives a direct message, doesn't it, to every single one of his victims. We couldn't save you then, but you matter, and we'll protect you now. In the 1980s, Top of the Pops is still going strong, but in between that, in 1975, we see him get this amazing show. Jim Will Fix It. Jim will fix it for you to have all your dreams come true. Look how he's pivoting through all of these careers. This is really hard. Look, I work in the media. It's really difficult for somebody to go from a radio DJ to a TV presenter, DJ doing music for basic young adults, to kids show with them sat on his knee, making dreams come true. I mean, it's basically like he just gets to choose whatever he wants to do, wherever he wants to go. I'm pretty sure if he'd had further opportunities, he'd have ended up doing play school, as long as he could have brought the kids in. That's the kind of character. He's weaving and he's waving his way through. He's getting new allies. Who are these allies? And why are they creating these visual opportunities for him? But why are they creating these visual opportunities as they, oh, Jimmy, he's safe. You should definitely trust Jimmy. Look, he makes all these dreams come true for children. I mean, for me, that pangs of something a little bit more orchestrated. Only my opinion, but I think it's a pretty informed opinion from what I can see regarding these kind of behaviours. Now, in the 1980s, again, we get another clear example, an absolutely clear example that he is abusing girls. She's been to tell the Metropolitan Police that she's been assaulted in Savile's camper van in a BBC car park. Why can't that police file be located?
There are some people who are incredibly powerful. Savile was one of them. Savile was facilitated by some of those people. You know, I wrote did a piece in the Radio Times around the time, and I said that I thought that he used his vehicle, such as Jim Will Fix It, to gain access to children. And I genuinely believe that. Not necessarily every time he did work with children was his vehicle for abusing, but there clearly Jim Will Fix It gave him that opportunity, gave him that access to children. He was a predatory sex offender. He was an interesting sex offender because, by and large, the sex offenders that we deal with tend to be quite specific in terms of their target. They'll either be young children, prepubescent, boys, girls, or adolescents, but separating between male and female. There is obviously always this crossover between young children, between male and female, because of the lack of development. But Savile ranged from 7 to 80 as far as his offending behaviour. Quite a unique character of offending behaviour, which isn't something that you can transport into many offenders. So that was quite a unique element about it.
Before I start sharing this next bit of information with you, I just want to say that if you have been a victim of sexual abuse and molestation, if you are somebody who particularly was affected in care, then you might want to think about whether you listen to this next piece, because all of this is obviously terrifying and disgusting, and most importantly, I think we both agree that Jimmy Savile had a lot of help. But what I'm going to talk about next actually made me want to be sick. And I am long in the tooth of working with trauma, but the level of collusion that I think occurred in this next piece may be too much for you to hear. So just protect yourself. You know, you can fast forward a few minutes and I will come back and make it clear on my camera cut that I've now finished that part of the piece. But otherwise, hold fast. This is not pretty. Savile's first contact with Broadmoor. Okay, just take a step back for a minute, guys. Broadmoor? Yeah. Ian Brady, the Yorkshire Ripper. And also, let's be honest, Broadmoor is known notoriously for those kind of serial killers. But it's also a place of very vulnerable, mentally unwell human beings who may have been in the prison system, and the prison system was not seen as acceptable for them, and therefore they were transferred there. This idea that Broadmoor just has the criminally insane who are all out there about to murder you if they get out just is completely untrue. There have been some really harsh developments in that particular place, where once it was quite a therapeutic community and then it became a highly aggressively policed community. And I think somewhere now they're in between changing some of those situations, but we can say that Broadmoor was not necessarily the nicest place to be sent. And like I said, if you had the unfortunate position of being sent somewhere where you were also having access to people who had murdered children, raped children, mutilated bodies, killed women, it's not a great place or space to go. Which begs this question. How the hell did Jimmy Savile end up getting in contact with Broadmoor, charming his way into probably some of the most sensitive medical institutions in the world? Let me tell you now, if I was to ring up Broadmoor with all of my experience in the media and all of my experience in therapy and working in trauma work and on crime shows, the likely outcome would be no. This is a working environment where we've got very high profile and very high risk patients. We need to make sure that they're protected on a confidentiality level, because after all, part of the paradigm for psychiatry and psychology and therapy is confidentiality. You don't just let somebody walk off the street. It's not 1803 where you could bring people into the asylum from the public just so they could make fun of people. Yes, that did happen. Not anymore. We have ethics. Basically, Jimmy Savile got a lot of fan letters from the hospital patients. There is a part of my brain that just wants to go, maybe they wrote Jim will fix it for me to get freed. I don't know. But for whatever reason, that made him ring up Broadmoor's entertainment officer in 1968. And just to say, there was a whole entertainment program in Broadmoor. It didn't used to be the kind of environment that you would hear of now, and they would have lots of therapeutic play, people would be encouraged to do theatre productions, and actually it was a way of trying to help those individuals who dealt with mental illness and mental health issues to be as productive and to feel as safe as possible. So he rings the entertainment officer. Imagine that, you're working in Broadmoor and you've got Jimmy Savile, the legend, that's getting on the phone to you, and he's saying that he wants to visit. Dr. Pat McGrath literally said, hey, why not? In fact, why don't you just provide entertainment and organise celebrity appearances for patients? Because it will be good positivity and publicity for the hospital. Now, I get that, because the truth is, if you know that a lot of organisations have got celebrity ambassadors, and it's because they need to raise money. This idea that everything is public funded just isn't true. We often see that with hospices, and certainly with certain therapeutic institutions, you are relying on extra money if you want to create, let's say, new blocks. You might have a certain amount of public funding, but if you want to expand or create new opportunities, you're going to be reliant on that kind of stuff. And of course, Mr. Charity, Mr. Hero, Jimmy Savile, he is there, isn't he? With his constant cigar smoking and bizarre looking outfits. And within weeks, Savile's basically been given the keys. Just have the keys, Jimmy. It's like, here. And you can just wander around the wards in one of the highest security hospitals in the world, in a completely honorary entertainment officer role. So basically he gets complete trust, and the authority figure in the hospital is firstly thinking, brilliant, how much publicity are we going to get? That's great, and I'm going to be seen as that person instituting it, and I'm just going to allow this person not only to be on site, I'm going to allow them a house and car parking. I mean, mind blown. So one of the things that we also know about this opportunity is that he just didn't follow any pattern. He'd just come whenever he fancied. He'd bring his caravan. He'd have his car washed by patients in the hospital garage. And it really was a contentious issue. Him being there was really contentious. The Broadmoor staff were polarised, okay? They were polarised because, be honest, a lot of therapeutic practitioners, psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, they're going to be looking and thinking to themselves, what is this guy without any training being given keys to one of the most high security institutions in the world? But who's going to challenge McGrath, right? Because in 1978, he actually was quoted to the paper saying that Savile being given the keys in a special security hospital was the highest mark of trust the management can offer. It just shows you, doesn't it? If you've got a celebrity status, you can just avoid the normal social norms that we would expect anybody to have. And if you think about it today, you can't even go and be a volunteer in a school unless you have a DBS check, and rightfully so. We have learnt from horrific breaches of trust that people at least need to have investigations done on them before they take up these roles. It doesn't always mean that those people are safe, but it means that we create one barrier, and that barrier is sometimes enough to prevent those things happening. The trust that Broadmoor gave him basically made Savile invincible on the hospital wards. And in 1987, because of those keys, basically it gave him what they called a gold-plated access. And just as he had gained the trust in the original McGrath in '68, now he moves on to Cliff Graham, who's a civil servant. Now, he hadn't met the DG on his first visit to Broadmoor because loads of sweeping changes to the mental health policy. What happened is somehow he gets involved in running it. I mean, he's running part of Broadmoor. It's bizarre. One of his running partners, an actual person that he runs marathons with and had very little experience, was also appointed Broadmoor's general manager. Is it just me right now who's sitting there going, where did sense leave the building? So not only have we got a gold-plated entrance opportunity for Jimmy Savile, we've got his running mate just coming in and general manager. I mean, that'll be easy, won't it, Broadmoor? Massive, high security, complex, people with huge vulnerabilities, just bring in a mate, be fine. And you know what? The women said, those patients, those female patients said that there was so much inappropriate behaviour. They'd be showered naked in front of staff. In fact, one member of staff said that 2 of the patients had killed themselves because of the abuse. The idea that the most vulnerable people in one of the most secure units became so vulnerable and so insecure because of those disgusting failures in care is something of a national shame. In fact, 5 individuals, they believe, were sexually attacked by Savile at Broadmoor, and I'll be honest with you, I think there were many, many, many more. And it was repeated. Because the thing is about a predator is they get to know the most vulnerable of vulnerable. They get to see the people by their behaviour. In fact, there are videos where predators who are in prison are asked to witness people walking down an alley. And pretty much 100% of the time, they pick out the one who's been raped. Just our human behaviour, the way we walk, the way we look. We become victims because we stand out to those wolves. They can see us, even when we're completely blind to it. And he must have seen them. He stalked those corridors without any issue right into the 1990s. And obviously at that point, new management came in and clearly somebody said, what the hell is Jimmy Savile, the unqualified weirdo, being allowed to wander around any vulnerable patients, being allowed to do that? So thank God at that point somebody did see sense. Okay, if you were worried about watching the part that I was just describing, I have stopped talking about that. So please feel free to start viewing again. Okay, so 1990 is a whole heap of crazy. Remember what his past is like. Savile's knighted. Let's just make him a sir. I mean, that makes sense. He's only had loads of people suggest that he's abused them. He's only been clearly odd around children for a period of time. And actually in 1994, just to put this into context, when he loses the show Jim Will Fix It, Roger Ordish, who was basically managing that, said on a radio show that he made it clear that Jimmy Savile should not be left alone with children. People knew. So many people knew. But that's the problem, you see. When people are untouchable and powerful and people have got this reputation, so few people are willing to go there. And don't think it doesn't happen today. Don't think it doesn't happen today. There are certain people in the press all over the world that you can track back allegations, but those allegations are sunk. And you can bet your bottom dollar if somebody in Love Island basically coughs in the wrong place, they'll have an expose and be taken down. It's not an equal world. If you have money and power and connections like Epstein did, well, you can pretty much get away with anything. And actually that's really interesting. We'll come back to Epstein at another point, because how did they sanitize sex exploitation through that, hey? How did they pinpoint the kingpin? Who really wasn't the kingpin? Who really isn't the kingpin? But what a convenient thing to pin on him. Even though he's a reprehensible human being who does not deserve to walk this earth, the point is, don't be deceived. He is just one in a very, very big pond of very, very dangerous people. In 2000, there was an amazing documentary. Now, I love Louis Theroux. I'm not going to deny it. He is my documentary presenter crush. There is just something weirdly wonderful about that guy. His amazing use of awkwardness to get people to speak, and his warmth. People have different opinions. You're all welcome. You might tell me you hate Louis Theroux and to stop saying that. But I think that what he gave us was a real example of a human being who was reaching in to get to know Jimmy. And the thing about Louis is he does that really well. He does it really effectively. He uses some pretty incredible psychological tactics. If you watch the way that he uses his own awkwardness, and he says things that other people wouldn't say, but he says it in such a way as if he's the one with the issue, which is why he needs the explanation. And he's so unassuming that you just kind of like him. And he never fully engages in the process. Like, he's there, but he's kind of still observational, and he does it with such vigor and such incredible ability. It is wonderful to watch. Now, he worked with Jimmy because he wanted to get to know him, and he did acknowledge that there were rumors about him being a paedophile, but obviously he denies it completely. He's gonna deny it. And on the 26th of July 2006, Savile actually, 2006, and he manages to co-present the final Top of the Pops, the iconic show that people like me grew up on. I mean, Top of the Pops was the be-all and end-all. And one of the things that you will see in the press, that it's one of the most terrifying things, is back in the day, early on, when he was presenting, you physically see him put his hand up a girl's skirt stood next to him, and she recoils. He physically did it on screen, and nobody did anything. And in fact, there is a recording, and it's one of those recordings that's upsetting to hear. Again, I'm gonna say to you, if you don't wanna hear Jimmy Savile being abusive towards a young person, please do not listen. It's really triggering, particularly if you're a young person or an adult who's been molested and you felt that the person was being friendly towards you even though you knew it was wrong. It's kind of quite upsetting to listen to this piece. When you listen to this, you will completely understand how clever predators work. They absolutely convince the victim that they're just having a bit of fun, that it's just normal, that they just want them to think that they're the special person. Listen.
Who's your best pal, tell me?
I'm not telling you. No, Desmond.
He's not.
He is.
No, he's not.
Get off me.
Because he's a married man.
Don't care.
Yes, you do.
Get off.
I won't. Not
No,
until,
because you're squashing.
not until you say me.
Me.
Say, I promise
I promise.
that you, Jimmy Savile,
You, Jimmy Savile,
are the only one
are the only one.
in my life,
No, you're not the only one in my life.
and Noel Edmonds and all them others is definitely not. Ooh, get off. Who's your best pal?
You as a pal, get off my backside.
Hey? I beg your pardon? In front of your mummy and daddy? Goodness gracious.
Now, what's amazing about that July 2006 performance of Top of the Pops is that was one of the allegations that was then brought up, okay? So somebody comes forward, and that's what we see a great deal with historic abuse. And this is why Boris Johnson appalls me when he talks about historic abuse spaffing money up the wall, because he doesn't think that there's any point looking back at historic cases. There is absolute point, because we don't know how to disengage and completely break down paedophile networks unless we know where they begin and the timeline. So essentially the family tree of where it begins and where it leads to. So historic abuse isn't just important for the victim to get the justice they deserve. It's important because it leads us to the right people. If you think that paedophilia is about some strange odd man or woman on a corner looking odd, abusing children individually, you are so wrong. They are network based. Let me put it into the context of this. Google is 5% of the web. The deep dark web and the dark web is 95%. 95% of the web. That's all bad stuff going on, right? These are specific, these are very sophisticated, and these are highly connected individuals. And police have whole departments who are very good at breaking these down, but as soon as one is broken down, they spring up again. So figuring out where it comes from is really important, which is why historic abuse is important. And some woman was no doubt watching that and thinking, how dare you? How dare you, even now, even with all of the history that you've clearly abused, how dare you be on that show? In March 2008, Savile actually starts a legal proceeding against a newspaper. He was linked to some abuse at a Jersey children's home, which clearly he was involved in. Now, the police, as you would expect, they did investigate it, and apparently the CPS said there was insufficient evidence. That was the last year that any offence was recorded against him. But the point is, again, surely the evidence should have been more explicitly explored. Because you're talking about women coming forward throughout the decades. And there was actually a 43-year-old woman who was sexually assaulted by Savile on a train to London between a journey between Leeds and London. And that police have that example too. What was going on? Now, probably the biggest injustice, in 2011, the scandal actually comes out, and suddenly we see that the news is broken and that Jimmy Savile is the predator that so many knew, and so many helped, and so many were afraid to bring to justice. And on the 29th of October, he dies. And this is what really annoys me. Really annoys me. So how come when he dies, they start investigating properly? What does that say to you?
In terms of his untouchability, he created that because he created a persona of being untouchable. And he surrounded himself, as many celebrities do, or high-profile people do, with those people that made him unfairly difficult to get to. He had gatekeepers. And what he enabled it to do is that he also created this persona of an individual who was a larger-than-life character. And I think his jokedness of who he was as a character, his gold, his bling, his tracksuits, meant that people were going, is he for real? Is that real? Is that serious? Is that a joke? So he created that persona that assisted him. There was undoubtedly people over his life, both within his small friend setup as well as within the establishments, who could have blown the whistle earlier, who knew that what he was doing at times was unacceptable, who knew that he was offending against females, but never did anything about it. And I say to those people is that I hope you sleep difficultly at night, because you could have made a difference. You could have saved a lot of people.
Now, this is going to completely blow your mind, because Newsnight start doing this investigation on him, and rightly so, about 30 years too late, but who's counting all those horrifically attacked victims that would have been saved had it been done earlier. But to add insult to injury, in spite of this, the BBC, knowing that this is happening, run a tribute programme to Jimmy Savile. And in fact, there are emails historically where they're being advised not to run it because there is this investigation happening, but no, they put it out there. Imagine what would motivate anyone to do that. Why are you trying to do that? What message is that giving to the victims? And let's be honest, everybody knew, because even I have heard people talk about the fact that they were aware of things happening back in the day and that they didn't want to talk about it because they were a young junior and it could have cost them a career. And yet the BBC ran with it. On the 5th of December, Surrey police confirm that they've investigated a historic allegation, and the CPS carries on saying that it's decided not to prosecute Savile because of the lack of evidence, because it was old evidence, because it's historic evidence. This cost versus benefits analysis is always something that drives me insane, because you see, it costs quite a lot of money to investigate anybody. And when the person's dead, arguably, is the cost versus benefit analysis going to be in favour when the person isn't going to be able to defend themselves, and they're certainly not going to be able to pursue a sentence? The Sunday Mirror in 2012 recognises that the Newsnight investigation was axed. Do you know why? Because it happened to be around the same time as this tribute show. I mean, of course, what would we choose to run with? The truth, or a massive fabrication that a man who systemically abused children for decades was still hailed as a hero? Sir Jimmy Savile, the man who had a relationship with Prince Charles as if he was a friend, the man who was basically given access to the palace. If you ever want to think about a high-profile paedophile, a high-profile child molester, an individual who is so good at manipulation, and bear in mind, he created a caricature of eccentricity. He was somebody who raised millions and millions and millions of pounds for charity. If you are a child molester and you want access to children, your job is to make everybody think that you must be a good guy. And even though everybody felt he was a real oddball, and a lot of people knew that he was really nasty, he created this persona around him, and that meant that people were too afraid to challenge him. On the 22nd of October, the Panorama special on the BBC and Savile is actually broadcast. And what we see then is a Commons Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee where Entwistle, who was in charge, had to appear to explain that. Now, that Director General, George Entwistle, he was the BBC Director General, had to give lots of evidence, and we decide that there has to be an investigation because obviously there has been a major injustice, and it turns out that Entwistle has to resign as a Director General. When all comes to all and the investigation goes forward, what we see is that it comes out that Jimmy Savile was a prolific sexual abuser. His criminal record would have been absolutely huge if he'd still been here to face it. I mean, it talks about 214 criminal offences across 28 police forces. And, you know, think about, they're the ones you know about. 73% of his victims were children. And also, the abuse took place over 14 different medical establishments. And in fact, if we're going to go with what Panorama reported, there were 500 reports of abuse on Savile. 500. He had access to abused people at Leeds General Infirmary, at Broadmoor. He was able to go into lots of children's homes, and the belief is he actually abused people from the ages of 5 to 75. 5 to 75. Jimmy Savile didn't care about sex in the way that you or I may. You know, as an intimate, bonding, growing, connected experience, or fun, or whatever you want to talk about and feel at your point in your sexual journey. It wasn't. All he wants is power, manipulation, and self-satisfaction. There is no concern for the person who he's abusing. It's purely down to being a predatory abuser who satisfies his own sexual predilections however, whenever, and with whoever he wants. And this is what makes him incredibly dangerous in my mind, aside from everything that clearly evidences he was. It's the fact that he went to find the most vulnerable people. It almost feels like his particular sexual attraction was towards the deeply vulnerable, disabled, and at risk, choosing the most challenged of victims. Because by doing that, you almost give yourself free rein to do as much damage, knowing that there'll be very little comeback. I have no doubt that Jimmy Savile is one of many, and I have no doubt that he was involved with networks, in my opinion, in my personal opinion, not even in my professional opinion, just in my personal opinion, that will have spanned decades like a spider's web throughout our community. And he faced absolutely no justice. Because I imagine what the conversations he would have with Peter Sutcliffe would be about, and I don't think for 1 minute it would have been about a therapeutic conversation about how Peter was doing and his motivations for his crime and trying to create some empathy in that man. I imagine they were highly voyeuristic, sexually charged, mutually enjoyed conversations about the prolific abuse that Jimmy Savile was able to do on the victims across the board. And that's how sick the whole situation of misplaced power begins, middles, and ends. That Peter Sutcliffe and Jimmy Savile were allowed to just chat amongst themselves without any witnesses, without any causes for concern, and in some ways, in a way that elevated Jimmy to seem like the saint, the saviour, and the sir, instead of the devil and the demon in disguise. I hope you have found that interesting. I appreciate that was pretty hard listening. I hope you've enjoyed the footage that we've put in there. Please leave your comments. It's one of those stories that I think is really difficult to discuss. I want to make it clear to any of you who've been victims of sexual assault, sexual molestation, if you are a young person coming to this and you have been abused, it is never your fault. Predators are clever. They prey on good people. They are excellent at making you feel that you are the person in the wrong. That's what they do. You are never in the wrong. Doesn't matter what they tell you. Doesn't matter how they coerce you. Don't believe them when they say they're going to kill you. Don't believe them when they say your family's not going to love you anymore. This is standard behaviour for predators. And just because they're buying you gifts and telling you that you're special and reminding you that they'll always be there for you, when your intuition tells you that they're wrong, when it's wrong, it's because you're right. Speak to somebody, reach out for help, get a teacher, a friend, a colleague, and have that conversation. Whether that's you experiencing it now, or whether that's you now at 50 years of age realising that this happened to you. Or maybe if you're one of the victims that didn't get justice from somebody like Jimmy Savile, speak out. You did nothing wrong. It's not your shame, it's their shame. Let me know if you've enjoyed this in a weird way. I'm always going to be aware that how do we really enjoy talking about this kind of stuff? But hopefully I've told you a little bit more than you would have known about somebody that I hope has a special place just for him in hell, probably with Peter Sutcliffe, where they both don't get to talk anymore, but certainly get to see the damage and torture that each of them equally deserved. As I said, this is my YouTube channel. It's not about me being professional, it's about me being real. Subscribe